Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, St Helens. It's Friday afternoon. It's the 29th of January. It's the end of our fourth week at school, and it's time for the next instalment of the story, the Twits. Now, I know Mr. Chappell has done a brilliant job of reading this story, and to be honest, I haven't actually read one for a little while, so I thought it was time for me to get stuck in, and I love this story, and we're at a particularly exciting bit. So I'm going to quickly grab the book because it's down on the floor here. Which wasn't a very good place for me to put it. It wasn't very well prepared. But if I flick back to where we are, we're on chapter 10. And something quite exciting is about to happen to Mrs. Twit. Well, maybe not if you're Mrs. Twit. Maybe it's exciting. Maybe it's a bit scary. We'll find out, won't we? So chapter 10, Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for what he was calling the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and he had lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring, and then he tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. Just to show you the iron ring, it's just there. You can see her feet tied to it with probably a bit of rope, bit of string. And when that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. If you've ever seen one of those helium balloons, that's what it was doing. It was kind of pulling up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied round her neck, some he tied under her arms, some to her wrists, and some he even tied to her hair. And soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mrs. Twit. I can, said Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." Well, he put on another 10 balloons, and then the upward pull became really strong. Well, Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights in order to teach her a lesson. And here she is here. Can you see her there? The balloons stretching her up, trying to make her taller. Her feet tied to the ground. And there's Mr. Twit pumping up another balloon just to try and get that stretch even tighter. Anyway, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something a little bit silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she said. "Because if those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit a nasty idea. Chapter 11, Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. Maybe you can imagine what might happen next. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen, would we?" "Oh, no." "And I mean, we most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring, and she went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky, and she was still climbing fast. And Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old hag is gone forever." And there she is. Look at her. She's gone right out the top of the picture, and there he is down the bottom. But it's not quite the end of the story, because chapter 12 is called Mrs. Twit Comes Ballooning Down. Well, Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can just get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I'll stop going up and start to come down." Well, she began biting through the strings that held her balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair, and each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got a little bit less, and her rate of climbing up started to come down. But when she bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string, and then very, very slowly she began to float downwards. It was a calm day, There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up, and now she began to come absolutely straight down. And as she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying around for miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. And there she is, biting off some of those strings and starting to make her way down. Chapter 13, and the last chapter for today. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Well, Mr. Twit thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, and he was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Well, silently Mrs. Twit came floating down, and when she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you gruzzy old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet." Mr. Twit jumped as if he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer. He looked up. He gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Ah!" he cried. "Ah! Ouch!" And there he is there. Look at him there, dropping his mug of beer on the floor and looking up in the air. And look what happened next. Next picture. She's coming to get him, isn't she? "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. Well, she was floating right down on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with a long walking stick, which she'd somehow managed to hold on to all this time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over the body. And so that is where we're going to leave it today. And we'll find out what happens next. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a great weekend. And we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.